Hey everyone, welcome to part 27 of my Pokemon tutorial series in Unity. In the previous video, we added NPCs to our game. So in this video, we'll implement dialog system and show dialogues when the player speaks to the NPC. Special thanks to all my Patreons for making this series possible. By becoming a Patreon, you can support me in the making of the series and get some cool rewards like access to the complete project files of the series. Okay, so let's start the video. So first, I'm going to add the UI for the dialog box. So in my scene, I'll right click and create a new image. Okay, so this will automatically create a canvas for us. And in the canvas settings, I need to change UI scale mode from constant pixel size to scale with screen size. All right. So this will automatically scale all the UI in the canvas when we resize our screen. All right, so next I'll change the name of my image to dialog box. And for the image of the dialog box, I'm going to use this image that we used for the dialog box in our battle system. Alright, so note that this image is actually sliced so that the part of this image outside this green box is not scaled. So we did that in part 8 when we created the dialog box for the battle system. So if you haven't watched that video, please watch that first before you continue because these things are explained in it. So let me use this image for my dialog box. Okay, and let me just double click on the canvas so that it's focused. Okay, and let me just resize the dialog box image. So for the width, I'll say something like 760, and for the height, 150. Okay, so that looks good to me. And let's also change its pivot along with its position. So I'm going to hold Alt and click on this and change its pivot to bottom. Okay, so I want this to be a little above. So let me just drag that. All right, that looks okay to me. So next we need to add a text inside the dialog box. So I'll go to UI and add a text. I'll rename this to dialog text. And for the dialog text, we want it to cover the entire image. So I'm going to hold Alt and change its pivot and position to stretch on both sides. Okay. So now it's the same size as that of the dialog box. But I want the text to have a little bit of padding. So for top, I'll say 15 and same for the bottom. And I'll change left and right to 10. Okay, so that's how I want this. And for the text, I'll change the font to Orange Kit and I'll change the font size to 40. And let me just replace this with a text dialog. Okay, so this is just to see how the dialog looks like. So next, let's create the script for the dialog system. So inside my scripts, inside gameplay folder, I'll create a new script called DialogManager. So inside the script, first we need a reference to the dialog box image and dialog text. So I'll create a game object to store the dialog box, and I'll create a text to store the dialog text. Note that for text we have to import unityengine.ui. Okay, so next I'll create a public function to show the dialog. So this function should take the dialog that should be shown, right? So we can just take a list of string for that, but what I'll do is I'll create a separate class so that in the future we'll easily be able to expand on that. So inside my scripts folder, inside gameplay, I'll create a new C# script called Dialog. And let me open that up. Okay. So this is going to be a plain class. And in here we need a list of dialogues. So I'll create a list of string and I'll call this lines. Okay. So I'll also create a property to expose this. So the reason why I made this into a class is because in the future we might want the NPC to give an item to the user after the dialogue, or trigger some story items or quest. So when we want to add all that, we'll be able to add it over here. So let me also make this class system.serializable so that it'll appear in the inspector. Okay, so let's go back to the dialog manager, and show dialog will take an object of the dialog class. So in here, first we need to actually activate the dialog box, right? So I'll do that first. So next we need to show the first line of the dialog. So we can simply say dialog text equal to dialog lines of 0. Okay, so this will show the first line of the dialog in our dialog box. But I don't want to show it like this. Instead, I want to animate the dialog word by word. So we have already done that in the dialog box of our battle system. So let me open the script of our battle dialog box. Okay. So in here you can see we have a function called type dialog. So I'll just copy this and paste it inside my dialog manager. Okay, so we don't need this last line here, since we don't want to wait 1 second after showing the dialog. In this dialog system, everything will be controlled by the user's input. So in this function, what we're doing is, first we are setting the text in the dialog to empty string, and then we are looping through each letter of the dialog and adding it one by one to our text, right? And after adding each letter, we'll wait for some time. So this will make it feel like the dialog is being typed letter by letter, right? So we need to define this letters per second variable over here. So I'll do that. Okay, and I'll just change this parameter name from dialog to line to avoid confusion, since we already have a dialog over here. So now, instead of setting the text directly, we can call the type dialog coroutine, and I'll just pass the first line of the dialog to it. So next we actually need to call the show dialog function when the player interacts with the NPC, right? So inside my NPC controller, right now in the interact function, I'm just showing a log message, right? So instead of that, I should show the dialog. So first we need a way to reference the DialogManager script from the NPC controller. So what I'll do is, since the DialogManager script will be used from a lot of different places, I'll use singleton design pattern here. So here I'll create a static property of the DialogManager itself, and I'll call it instance. Okay, I'll just make the setter private so that we can only set it from inside this class. And let's actually set this in the awake function. Okay, so in the awake, I'll set instance to this. So since this is a static property, we will be able to reference this from any class we want. So let's actually do this inside NPC controller. So I'll say dialog manager dot instance, And now we have an instance to the dialog manager, and we can call all the functions inside it. So let's call show dialog, and we need to pass the dialog, right? So let me create a variable for the dialog. Okay, and I'll just pass the dialog as the parameter. So the singleton pattern makes things a lot easy for us, but you have to be really careful when you use this. Since it's very easy to access the instance of Dialog Manager, it's also really easy to create unwanted dependencies to it from different classes. So just be careful not to make any unwanted dependencies from classes that don't need to reference the Dialog Manager. Okay, so let's actually test if this works. So I'll add the Dialog Manager script to my game controller. So all the manager scripts are going to be placed over here. The reason why I didn't place it in the dialog box is because dialog box will be inactive when we start the game, so the script won't load. Okay, so inside the dialog manager script, we need to assign the dialog box game object and the dialog text. Okay, and for the letters per second, I'll say something like 45. So next, inside our NPC controller script, let's actually give some dialog. Let's say we want 2 lines, and let me just enter some dialog. Okay, and finally we need to disable the dialog box initially because we don't want the dialog box to be shown when the game starts, right? So let's test the game now. Okay, so if we go and talk to the NPC, all right, so you can see that the dialog that we gave inside the NPC controller was shown over here. So right now we are only showing the first line of the dialog. So after showing the first dialog, when the player presses Z, we should actually show the second line, right? But now when I press Z, it's just showing the same dialog again. And one more issue that we want to fix is we don't want the player to be able to walk when a dialog is being shown, right? So right now, when a dialog is being shown, I can still walk around, but they should be blocked, right? So we'll do that next. So first, to make sure that the player can't move when a dialog is being shown, we are going to use state design pattern. So if you open the game controller script, we are already using this pattern to control the free roam and battle state, right? So in the update, if the state is free roam, then we'll call handle update on player controller, and otherwise we'll call handle update on the battle system, right? So what I'll do is I'll add a new state called dialog, and in the update function, if the state is equal to dialog, then I'll call handle update on the dialog manager. So inside our dialog manager, let's create a public function called handle update. Okay, and from our game controller, we'll call dialog manager dot instance dot handle update. Okay, so now all we have to do is change the state to dialog when showing the dialog. And if the state is dialog, then we won't call player controller dot handle update, which means the player won't be able to move. So to set the state to dialog, I'm going to create an event inside dialog manager that will notify the game controller, right? So just like we did for battle. When a player encounters a wild Pokemon, then we will trigger this on encountered event, which will call the start battle function and set the state to battle, right? So similarly, I'm going to create an event inside my dialog manager. So here I'll create an event called on show dialog. So to use action, we need to import the system namespace. So let me do that. And we also need an event called on close dialog. which will trigger when dialog is closed. So next, when the show dialog is called, we also need to trigger the onShow dialog event, right? So I'll say onShow dialog dot invoke. So back in our game controller, we need to subscribe to the onShow dialog and onClose dialog events, right? So first let's subscribe to the onShow event. Okay, so I'm going to use a lambda function here, since all this function will do is change the state to dialog. If you want, you can actually create a function like this and assign it over here, but I'm just going to use lambda. So inside this function, I'll set the state to GameState.dialog. Okay, so next we want to subscribe to the onClose dialog event. So let me just copy this and I'll change this to onClose dialog. So in the case of onClose dialog, we'll just change the game state back to free roam, right? And we only want to do this if the current state is actually dialog. So I'll add an if condition on top of that. Okay, so this is because in some cases we might want to go from the dialog state to the battle state. For example, when we implement trainers, after we show the dialogues of the trainer, we'll directly go to a trainer battle, right? So in that case, the state will not be dialog and we won't go back to the free roam state. All right. So next, inside the dialog manager, we actually need to implement our handle update function, right? So if the player is in the dialog state and presses the Z key, then we want to show the next line of the dialog, right? And if there is no line remaining, then we just want to close the dialog. So first, let's check for input from player. Okay, so I'll check if Z key is pressed. So I need a variable to store the current line of the dialog. So let me create an integer variable over here. And I also need to store the dialog in a global object. So right now it's only accessible inside the show dialog function, right? So I'll create a variable for that. And when show dialog is called, I'll assign the dialog to the global variable. Okay. So now when the Z key is pressed, first we want to increment the current line variable. And then we'll check if current line is less than the number of lines in the dialog. Okay, so if it's less than the number of lines, then we need to show the next line, right? So I'll just call the type dialog coroutine, and for the line I'll pass the current line, right? And otherwise we just have to close the dialog box. So I'll say dialog box dot set active false to disable it, and we'll also invoke the on close dialog event. Okay, so one more thing I'll do is I'll set the current line back to 0, so that next time we start a dialog, it starts from 0. All right. So next, there is an edge case that we need to solve. Let's say we are in the middle of typing a dialog and the user presses the Z key. So this will actually show the next dialog before actually completing the current dialog, right? So to fix that, I'm going to create a Boolean variable called isTyping. And at the start of this coroutine, I'll set isTyping to true. And in the end, I'll set it to false, right? So now when the player presses the Z key, we only want to do all this if typing is false. right? So I'll just add another condition. Okay, so that case is solved. And next we also need to solve another case. So we are actually calling the show dialog when the user comes near the NPC and press Z, right? And inside the show dialog, we are showing the first line. So the problem is when we reach the handle update function, the Z key will still be pressed. So this is because we are doing all this in the same frame in which user tried to interact with the NPC, right? So this can cause problem for us in the future. So what I'll do is I'll wait for one frame before executing all the logic inside the show dialog. So if I wait for the end of the frame, then Z key won't be pressed anymore and this edge case won't happen. So to wait for a frame, we can use shield return new wait for end of frame. Okay, so to use that, obviously we need to make our show dialog a coroutine. And if show dialog is a coroutine, then we have to use start coroutine here. Okay, so simply waiting for the frame to end before we start the dialog will help us avoid lots of headaches in the future. Alright, so we are done with the implementation of dialog. So let's test if it's working fine. So if I go talk to the NPC, it shows the first dialog and I can't move my character when a dialog is being shown. And next, if I press Z, it will show the second line of the dialog, right? So since we only have two lines, when I press Z again, the dialog should be closed. Okay, so now the dialog is closed and I can move around like usual. So yeah, let me go and test again. It'll show the two lines and after that, the dialog is closed. So we are done with the dialog system. I'll stop the video here. If you think this video is helpful, please leave a like on the video and consider subscribing to my channel. That'll really help me a lot. So I'll see you in the next video.